We're going to be studying for Lent this year the book of Jeremiah. And like so many things in the Bible, there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't matter how much common sense you have, you're just never going to understand it without a little bit of help. Some of these things we have to learn, we have to study, and Jeremiah is one of those books. It's one of the biggest, longest books in the entire Bible. I will tell you, this was one of my focuses in, or foci, man, all my breaths and foci. But anyway, in seminary, I spent years, literally years, studying the major prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. And after all of that, I pretty much figured out I don't understand it at all. So I'm going to try and share some of the big picture points with you. If you want to do more, because this is interesting to you, I would encourage you, email me, and certainly I can point you in the direction of new resources or some commentaries. Jeremiah is a great book. There's no question. But if you don't know the historical context, if you don't know kind of what's going on around the book, you can absolutely read things into it that are just incorrect interpretations. So anyway, I look forward to introducing you to this topic. One of the things that I'll point out up front, and then we'll get into the video, is that Jeremiah, as a prophet, the goal of the prophets is always, well, one of them is always to point out the sins of the people, right? To help people take a deep breath and look in the mirror and start being serious about where they're straying from God, in particular, not just individuals, but nations, the nations of Israel, and in our case, for Jeremiah, Judah. So it can be a very negative thing, but sometimes that's important. Because when a people gets complacent, when God's people get satisfied, that's really when we get into trouble. We're going to talk about this quite a bit over the next 5 weeks. The goal of this series also, remember, Lent is not supposed to be a time that we're like all excited and high-fiving. That happens after Palm Sunday on Easter, after Holy Week. It happens after Jesus is crucified. The idea is that we're going to press towards Holy Week. We're going to be thinking about some of the negative and serious consequences of our sin, which of course leads to Jesus' crucifixion. And then when we get to Easter Sunday, we're going to turn that around, obviously, where there's a whole lot of celebration and a whole lot of good news. As we start Lent, and many of you have done this, and I do want to encourage you, it's been amazing how many of you have been fasting. I lost almost 2 pounds just eating a whole lot of vegetables. Some of you have told me you've lost 5, 6, 7 pounds, and you're like, man, maybe I'm just going to keep eating this way. I haven't yet had anyone come up and say, Thomas, that's the stupidest thing ever. Don't you ever... For those of you who have done it, I would encourage you, if you want to, keep doing it. I'm going to stop. I'm going to start fasting again the week of Passion Week, so that'll be Palm Sunday after our big Easter event. I'm going to do the Daniel fast again the week before Easter, and then Easter morning, I'm going to have a big old bacon and egg breakfast, right? So I don't know about you, but if you didn't eat protein until this morning, wasn't that the best breakfast you have ever had in your life? But anyway, for those of you who are new, what we're saying is for the 40 days before Easter, if you're up for it, just vegetables, fruits, nuts, grains, healthy. We're going to have a devotional every day. No excuses. No excuses. We're going to spend a little time with Jesus every day. As best as you can, you're going to have a true Sabbath every Sunday for at least these 6 weeks. Just 6 weeks, we can do this. And we're going to think about Jesus all the time. Now, when I was hungry this week and I was looking in the fridge at all the stuff I couldn't eat, those of you who did it, you know what I'm talking about. I'm asking myself, why am I doing this? You know what the answer was? Jesus. It's weird. It's like it's biblical or something. We are commanded to fast in the Scriptures. Not every day, but sometimes. If you didn't do it, I would encourage you, put that on your to-do list. If it helps you walk better with Jesus, that's a good thing. Final point. Last week, we talked about really trying to have some self-awareness on where we are tempted to sin, where we have struggles, where we have really fallen. The other piece is for you to give up whatever the most tempting thing, whatever it is that's in your life that you know is leading you down the wrong path. What have you given up? And even if you didn't give up something before, what are you willing to give up so that you might be more right, more righteous, more faithful to God, and so that you might be more healthy. Right? Okay, we'll dig into this a little bit more. For now, we're going to watch this video. Try to keep up, but if you can't keep up, that's okay. Go home and watch it on your own a couple times. But this is a really great intro to the overview of the book of Jeremiah. Let's run this, and then we'll talk some.
The book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was an Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem during the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. He was called as a prophet to warn Israel about the severe consequences of breaking their covenant with God through their idolatry and injustice, and he even predicted that the empire of Babylon would come as God's servant to bring this judgment on Israel by destroying Jerusalem, taking the people into exile. And sadly, his words became reality. Jeremiah lived through the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and witnessed the exile personally. Now, this book came into existence in a really interesting way. Chapter 36 tells us that after 20 years of Jeremiah's preaching in Jerusalem, God called him to collect all of his sermons and poems and essays and commit them to writing, which Jeremiah did by employing a scribe named Baruch, who wrote down and compiled all of this material into a scroll. Now, Baruch also gathered lots of stories about Jeremiah, and he linked all the pieces together. And so this is why the book reads like an anthology, a collection of collections. It's all been arranged to present this prophet as a messenger of God's justice and grace. So the book begins with God calling Jeremiah to be a prophet, and he's given a dual vocation. He will be a prophet to Israel, but also to the nations. And his words will both uproot and tear down, but also plant and build up. In other words, he's going to accuse Israel and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he also has a message of hope for the future. Now, this opening perfectly summarizes the first large section, chapters 1 to 24. It's a collection of Jeremiah's writings from before the exile. And the core idea here is that Israel has broken the covenant with God and violated all the terms of the agreement they made that are written in the Torah, and in a number of ways. They've adopted the worship of all kinds of Canaanite gods, building idol shrines all over the land, and Jeremiah develops the metaphor of idolatry as adultery, and uses the language of prostitution, promiscuity, unfaithfulness to describe how Israel has given their allegiance to other gods. Jeremiah also repeatedly accuses Israel's leaders. The priests, the kings, the other prophets have all become corrupt. They've abandoned the Torah and the covenant, which has led to a tragic result: rampant social injustice. The most vulnerable people in Israelite communities, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, were all being taken advantage of in clear violation of the laws of the Torah, and Israel's leaders didn't even seem to care. So a classic place where all of these ideas come together is in chapter 7. It's called Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. The Israelites are coming to worship their God in the temple as if everything is just fine, but outside the temple they are worshiping other gods, and some were even adopting the horrifying Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. And so Jeremiah makes his very unpopular announcement: the God of Israel is coming in judgment. He's going to destroy his own temple and punish Israel by sending an enemy from the north. This is an army that God would allow to conquer Jerusalem, and as you read on, you discover he's talking about the great empire of Babylon. And so this all leads up to a transition in chapter 25. Israel hasn't turned back to their God, and so in the first year of Babylon's new king, Nebuchadnezzar, God tells Jeremiah to announce that the Babylonian armies are headed for Israel and all of its neighbors to conquer them and take them into exile for 70 years. He compares Babylon to a cup of wine filled to the brim with God's just anger at all of Israel's injustice and idolatry, and God will make Israel and the nations drink from this cup. Now, this chapter is key to the book's design because everything that follows is going to focus on Babylon's coming attack. First on Israel in chapters 26 to 45, and then on the other nations in chapters 46 to 51. The section about Israel first contains stories about how Jeremiah begged Israel to turn back, how he warned them right up to the last minute, but the leaders of Israel kept rejecting him. This section concludes with a large collection of stories about how Jerusalem was under siege and eventually destroyed by Babylon, and about how Jeremiah was persecuted all through that time and eventually kidnapped and taken against his will to Egypt by a group of Israelite rebels. Now, right here in the middle, in between all of these dark stories of disaster and judgment, is a collection of Jeremiah's messages of hope for Israel's future. So he picks up on Moses' prediction that after Israel had broken the covenant and had gone into exile, see Deuteronomy 30, God would not abandon his people. Rather, he would renew his covenant with them and transform their hearts. Jeremiah develops this promise, and he says that God is going to one day inscribe the laws of the Torah, not on tablets, but rather on the hearts of his own people. He's going to heal their rebellion so that they can truly one day love and follow him fully. And so one day, Israel will return back to the land, and the Messiah from the line of David is going to come, and that's when all nations will come to recognize Israel's God as the true God. So these chapters are showing that despite Israel's apostasy, God is not going to let Israel's sin get the final word. Rather, his own faithfulness will bring about the fulfillment of his promises no matter what. After this, we find the large collection of poems about how God is going to use Babylon to judge the nations around Israel. So Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Damascus, Hazor. But then, surprisingly, the longest poems are saved for last, and they're about God's coming judgment on Babylon itself. So although God used this nation to execute his justice, God doesn't endorse their violence and idolatry, and so Babylon too will come under the standard of God's justice. And so Jeremiah denounces this nation's pride and injustice as well. Now, Babylon is larger than life in these poems, and it reminds us of the image of Babylon all the way back from Genesis chapter 11. Babylon has become the archetypal rebellious nation. In their glorification of wealth and war, God's going to give this nation over to its own destruction. The book concludes with a story taken from the end of the book of 2 Kings. It tells about Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem, how they destroyed the city walls and burned the temple and took the people into exile. The story shows how Jeremiah's warnings of judgment from chapters 1 through 24 were fulfilled. But then the chapter ends with a short story about the captive Israelite king Jehoiakim. He's heir to the line of David. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and shows him favor and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and that's how the book ends. So it's a little glimmer of hope. And this recalls Jeremiah's promises of hope from chapters 30 to 33. God hasn't abandoned his people or the promise of a future coming king from David's line. And so while this book contains a huge amount of warning and judgment, the final words conclude with a note of hope for the future. And that's what the book of Jeremiah is all about.
Phew, right? Y'all got all that? So like I said, overview, I wanted to expose you to this on purpose because my hope is that you'll go back and watch this on YouTube and kind of get a sense of what the book of Jeremiah is about. A lot going on there. And so what we're going to do for the next 5-6 weeks is to pull some of this out, the pieces of it that I think have a lot of relevance for us today. And this morning, just a few points I want to call to your attention, and then obviously this will be to be continued. A lot of this is in your sermon notes. Always, I would encourage you to go home and ponder this. First thing I want you to see is this period between basically 640 and 609 BC. It's one of the, I should back up. Before 722, you had what was called the United Kingdom of Israel, where it was just Israel. And it is somewhat similar to Israel today. There are certainly some parallels. But in 722, there was a divided kingdom in a sense, and the upper kingdom of Israel was wiped out by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom called Judah obviously remained. So we are talking about the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom that remained after the Assyrians wiped them out in 722. We have this one window of time, which is going to be my focus today and for the next week or two, a few sermons I should say, where they had a relative season of peace and prosperity. Now, why does this matter and how is this important? Well, if we look at a map of the region, you may kind of note this right here. Let me get my other color. This area right here would be modern-day Israel. All right? See my excellent handwriting. Egypt is down here. All right? In the time that we're talking about now, Assyria kind of owned all this area, but Assyria was definitely in decline. They had become a very weak superpower in a sense. And Babylon, many of you have heard of the Babylonians, okay? They were still weak, but they were growing in power. So one of the problems with living in Israel, and we've seen this, is it's one of the places, one of the fewer places in the world where you kind of have to go through Israel to get to the other kingdoms. Now, if you're living in Israel and you're not part of those other kingdoms, what's the problem when those kingdoms are at war? Exactly. It's hard for us to understand, but it might be something like, imagine that Canada is Russia. Imagine that maybe Texas is Poland or Croatia or something like that. Imagine that maybe China is Mexico. And let's imagine that China and Russia are at war. And we're in between, and we're not a superpower. I mean, we really don't understand anything like this today. We can see it on paper. But one of the issues that I'm going to bring up over and over again is that we are living in a period of prosperity and of peace that over the course of world history has been rarely seen. You know, Rome might be the closest thing we have to it, but it's unheard of for us to go, how many years since major war? Really, World War II was the last big one. Not to diminish Vietnam or Korea or the Gulf War, don't hear me wrong on that. But most of us have no idea what it's like to live in fear of being conquered by a foreign country. I do remember when I was a kid, and unfortunately it's getting further and further away, but we used to have nuclear drills. And it still stands out in my mind whereas a little bitty kid, they would sound the alarms, and we'd literally have to huddle under our desks just in case a nuclear bomb hit. And I do remember as a little kid going, so what's this going to help? It's like, so the nuclear bomb's going to come off, and I'm under this little paper mache desk. It's like anyway, 48 years later, I still remember that was horrifying. So anyway, you have this people who Assyria has been a world power. They're in decline. Egypt and Babylon were doing all they could to defeat Assyria, but they were also kind of weak. And so from 640 to 609, you have 30 years of relative peace and limited independence, which for the people of Judah, that was amazing. Now, as God's people, when we're living in a period of peace and prosperity, what's the problem with that? It is interesting. One of the days in my church history when the church was the most full ever was the Sunday after 9/11. If you look back in your statistics, every church in the country had like a 300% spike of attendance. Guess when? The Sunday after 9/11. Why is that? Why do we think it's more important to be in church after that type of event, but not when everything is peaceful? It's a big question. One that I do hope we're going to wrestle with at least a little bit over the next few weeks. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 1, so he's born, scholars disagree on all this stuff. Let's just think 650 to about 570. So he's born at the front end of this time of peace and prosperity, and he's called by God early on in life. And in Jeremiah chapter 1, there are two quick things that I want you to see that I think are worth taking home and just pondering. The first one relates to the omniscience, which is how God knows everything, and God sees everything, and God understands everything, and we don't. But listen to Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. And I'm just going to read one verse because I think it's just one of the big verses in the entire Old Testament that is so powerful. The Lord's word came to me, Jeremiah, and here's what God said: before I created you in the womb, I knew you. Before I, God, created you, not those two people. Before I created you in the womb, I knew you. I want to say that together. Before I created you in the womb, I knew you, right? Before I created you in the womb, I knew you. One more time. Before I created you. Yes. Whew. So many times in life, one of the problems, we think we're cosmic orphans and we're on this planet spinning out of control and we're from the dust, we're going to be, come out of the dust somehow. We're not created out of dust. We're accidentally somehow evolved from dust into what we are, but we go back to dust and that's the end of it. What if this is true? So many of us struggle with self-esteem. So many of us struggle because we live in this world where we openly practice idolatry, which means we put something else on the altar of our hearts instead of God and God's plan and God's will. And one of the things that we often do, especially the younger we are, and for parents and kids, be careful. We put other people on the altar of our hearts. And we think, if I could just be like them, if I could just look like her or be like him, right, that I'm going to be more fulfilled and satisfied. It's like our identity is caught up in somebody else, some other person. Folks, that is a real problem. You are not who other people say you are. You are who God knows you are. You are not a cosmic orphan. You are not an accident. You are not some random chance, evolved sludge to who you are, aimlessly living life until you die and then nobody cares. No. Before you were formed in your mother's womb, God knew you. Wow is right. The God who created the cosmos knows you. The God who created all sees you. There's a positive to that that is amazing, and there's a negative to that that ought to be a little bit scary. When you look down in Jeremiah chapter 1, those positives and negatives are highlighted in a sense where Jeremiah is called to dig up, and then he's called to plant. To dig up, plant. You'll see the red writing. Almost looks evil. To dig up and to plant. This is the big message of the prophets. And by the way, this is the big message of Jesus. Some of the scriptures, we won't turn to them, but God, you have searched me and you know me. Psalm 139, 1 through 4. Psalm 44, 21. God knows the secrets of your heart. Matthew 10:30, Jesus said, God knows the number of hairs on your head. God sees everything. God knows everything. You don't get away with everything, but you're never alone either. Can y'all figure out the message without me telling you from that? Positive side, you are never alone. You're never in a valley by yourself. There is no place that you or your heart can go that God isn't already there saying, I'm here for you and we can get through this together. You are going to be okay. Before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you and I know you and I will know you. You will be okay. I am here. We're good. The other side of the sheet of paper, though, I know you. I see you. I know what you're doing. I know what you're thinking. I know you're going where you shouldn't go. I know you're exposing yourself to something you shouldn't expose yourself to. I know when you've had a bad attitude. I know when you've neglected and strayed from my narrow path. I know when you've looked at my will for your life and you thumbed your nose at it and poo-pooed it. I know all the bad stuff too. There is nothing hidden from my sight. In that context, here you go. The word of the Lord from the prophet Jeremiah to the people of God. You need to dig up and root up and throw away the weeds in your life. And you need to plant and water and nurture the stuff that's good. I'll say it again. You need to dig up and uproot and throw away the weeds and the bad stuff, the stuff that tempts you to sin, the stuff that you are engaged in sin. You need to think of it as an eyeball that is leading you down the wrong. It is better, right, to enter heaven with one eyeball, as Jesus says, than to go to hell with great sight. No, this is not a hellfire and brimstone, but this is the prophet Jeremiah, and his point is to get our attention. That's what prophets do. And when Jesus says that, he's trying to get our attention. What is better for you? What is better for us? What is better for life? To be happy and whole and have peace and love and joy? Or to have all the things the world has to offer, but you're miserable all along the way? Gouge it out and throw it away. Have some humility, have some self-control, have some daily time where you start thinking seriously about the things you are doing, the people you're exposing yourself to, the shows, the internet that you're exposing yourself to, whatever it is. Think carefully about what needs to be uprooted and chunked, because it is not doing anything to help. It is only hurting. But also think carefully about the things you are doing that need to be watered. Or maybe there are things you aren't doing that would be the right thing, that you need to take those things and you need to plant it solidly in your life so it can grow. I mean, you have the obvious ones. We talked a little bit on the Ash Wednesday service. Like, this is why we need a devotional. If you're not having one, what you do is you take the devotional and you dig a big old hole in your heart and you stick it in there and you plant it and you make it, right, grow as big as possible. You take your relationship to Jesus. If you're married, you take your relationship to your spouse. If you have kids, you take that relationship and you plant it, and you don't let any weeds get in that garden. Do we understand this? And the weeds often, in the beginning, look pretty. They're tempting. It's not tempting if it's not temptation. The things of the world that are distractions that are getting in between you and maybe your spouse, or you and your kids, or you and your friends, or you and your walk with God, this is where we have to think carefully. Spend some time in reflection. Where am I nurturing and watering weeds? And where am I planting and nurturing things in my life that lead to true life in abundance? Last piece. If you think you can be the judge on what those things are, you are sadly mistaken. We have all grown up in a time when we are prosperous and we are content and we are arrogant and we are full of pride, we are full of greed, we are full of envy, we are full of laziness, we are full of covetousness. I mean, this is normal in our world. Matter of fact, in Deuteronomy, we won't turn back to it, but it's interesting. Way back then, here's what Moses says. When you get full and build nice houses, do not think my own strength and abilities have produced all this prosperity for me. Is that 4,000 years ago or today? Deuteronomy 8, 12 through 18, when you get full, when you build nice houses, don't think my own strength, my own abilities have produced all this prosperity for me. What happens to us, God's people, in periods of peace and prosperity? I will tell you, one of the first things that happens is we get ungrateful. So many of us, we get married, it's so great, but after a year or two, we get ungrateful. The reasons we married those people, well, it's, I've got to know you better. Ugh. Well, that's what happens when things normalize. Should it take a 9/11? I will tell you, one of the reasons people come to church after seasons of never going is because something in their life just completely craters and falls apart. Or they come to God, they come to church looking for a Band-Aid. That's not a bad, however you get here, I'm glad you're here. But God's not a Band-Aid. That you just have a problem, you come to church, you pray a prayer, and once you get a little better, you just throw away the Band-Aid and then go back to the way you lived before. That's not how this works. That's not how Jesus works. He is supposed to be Messiah, Lord, a new way of life, a lifestyle, a worldview change, not a Harry Potter magic wand. What's your perspective on God? How is the prosperity and peace of our my whole life, really? I mean, sure, how has this affected the urgency you have to get your life right with Jesus? How urgent should your walk with Christ be? I will submit to you, there is no other way for you to have the type of life that you really want. Not really my words. Jesus said something like, I am the way and the truth, and there is no other. I want to encourage you, and I want to slap you, right? This is the prophetic message. Do some homework. Do some soul searching. What do you need to uproot in your heart and in your home, in your marriage, on your television, on your computer? I don't know. What do you need to uproot and chunk? And what do you need to plant and nurture? Turn to God for wisdom in these things. And if you have the humility, as James says, you ask God for wisdom and He's going to tell you the answer. The issue is not if God's willing to tell us what to do next. The real issue is, are you willing to do what you already know God wants you to do? You do it, and here's what I know. Y'all listening? It works. It works. Following Jesus works. This is how I know this stuff is true. I can read it all day long. I can state all day long. I can make common sense all day long. But here's what I know. Year after year, month after month, day after day, when I follow Jesus on a regular basis, every day, I bear peace and love and joy just like Jesus says I will. And when I stray and I don't have quality time with Him and I don't follow what He says, you know what happens inside of me? I become an anxious, irritable wreck. Lent. What a great time. 40 days. Spend some time in self-reflection. Where have you allowed weeds to grow that you need to uproot and chunk? Chunk them. And in their place, what good and godly things do you need to grow? And we will continue next Sunday. Lord, thank you so much for today, for your love and your grace, and also for your truth. And we pray for all of us here, for those joining online, that we would have discernment moving forward through this week of Lent, and that we would have some humility, that our pride would go away, and that you would give us wisdom and discernment to just know where we can do better following you. Lord, I do pray for everyone here, for all of our loved ones, that we truly might know that height and depth and width and breadth of your love. May we follow you faithfully, be filled with your light of the world, to in turn be your light to all we know. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hey, thank you all so much for coming. Before you go, could you please stand and shake somebody's hand around you and say good morning. God bless you. So glad you were here. And God willing, we'll see you. And don't forget Wednesday night.